Well, good morning. Morning. Good to see everybody this morning. I'm excited to be doing the next interview in our series. And this morning we're talking with Ben Witherington again. The topic at hand this morning is the Bible and history. The Bible and history. And so we're going to go at this from a number of different angles as we talk this morning and converse. But I'll start out by saying that when it comes to the Bible and history, there's certainly no shortage, right, of matters to talk about. And today we're really only going to obviously touch the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. But even so, some of the topics that we're going to touch on are very, very important. And some of the questions that you're going to hear this morning are from submissions that some of you submitted. Some will just be impromptu as we talk. Some that I came up with myself. But since we focused a lot on the Old Testament in last week's interview, in the first discussion that Ben and I had, I want to move a little more towards Ben's home territory, I guess you could say, the New Testament. And since that's our starting point this morning, where better to start than with Jesus, right? So Ben, here's the first thing on the docket this morning. As we're talking about the Bible and history, actually we'll come to Jesus second. Let me ask, what do we mean actually, to preface this, when we talk about studying the Bible historically, which is obviously different than studying the history of the Bible?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with the definition of history. History is past significant events. It's not just anything that happened in the past. It's historic events, events of significance in the past. And written history is at best a subset of that. One of the things people don't much understand about the difference between what happened back there and how we report what happened back there is that written history is always facts plus interpretation. It's never just the facts. Because when somebody's going to report about what was significant or historic, they have to decide which events in the past were significant or historic, don't they, before they report them. So already that's an interpretation. Already that's a selection of events from the past that have some kind of significance that you want to interpret. Now, when we're coming to the Gospels or Acts or really any of the biblical history that we're talking about, we're talking not only about facts plus just any kind of interpretation. We're talking about facts plus theological interpretation, ethical interpretation, monotheistic interpretation. So it's already got, it's tendentious, as scholars would say. It has a particular point of view. Nobody in the New Testament is writing as objective observers of Jesus or Paul or Peter, in whom they have no personal investment. They're not like newspaper reporters. These are advocates. That's who they are. So when we're talking about the historical study of the Bible, one of the things that you have to say is you need to recognize up front what kind of documents these are. These are documents written by partisans, by advocates of Jesus and the Christian cause, and they're written from a particular point of view. And by and large, they're written for an in-house audience. They're written for Christians. All of them are written for Christians. They're not written for strangers. They're not written as evangelistic tracts to just hand out to somebody. They're written and are discussing discipleship, evangelism, mission, etc., with an in-house audience, people that we would call Christians. So when we're talking about history and the Bible and history in the Bible, all of that you need to know up front. And then the second thing to know is that since the Enlightenment, there has been an approach to the Bible that has become increasingly more and more uneasy with things like miracles. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, historical interpretation of the Bible and the New Testament has taken on a different look in the 18th and then the 19th and especially the 20th into the 21st century. It's no longer presumed that what the Bible says is just the facts, ma'am. Just give me the facts, right? It's not presumed. It's presumed that you need to read it critically, not necessarily skeptically, but you need to read the text critically, and you just don't take it at its word if you're approaching the material as a historian. So the historical study of the Bible, including the New Testament, involves critical scrutiny of the document and even asking the questions, well, did he really say this? Did this really happen? What does this really amount to? Okay? And so many historians today just assume that when you're approaching an ancient text like this, you come at it with a negatively critical view of things like miracles. It's sort of justification by doubt. You assume that those things either don't happen, or they're unlikely to have happened, or they involve something that happened, but they're interpreted in a theological way that a modern person wouldn't do, right? So that's kind of where we are in the discussion of all of that in approaching the Bible as history and the history in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. And I think that makes a number of lay folk, scholars aren't as uncomfortable with that. That's the circles they move in, the world they sort of live and move and have their breathing in, or have their being in. But among lay people, I think there's a certain discomfort of questioning the text, like you're talking about.
Right.
And so, how do we assuage some of those fears, perhaps?
Well, St. Jerome once said, defend the Bible, I'd as soon defend a lion. There is no book in modern history that has been subject to more critical scrutiny than the Bible. And yet the Bible's still standing and is still seen as a credible witness by millions of people around the world, including people with multiple doctorates and deep knowledge of what the text is actually like and the whole history of the text and all of that. So, when you hear somebody like Bart Ehrman say, well, we have to reinterpret all of these texts because miracles just don't happen. Frankly, miracles don't happen. And, when I heard Bart Ehrman say this, I said, well, Bart, how do you know miracles don't happen? He says, well, they can't happen. And I said, oh, I see, you're omniscient. You know what is possible and what is impossible in the space-time continuum. And therefore, from a posture of omniscience, you know that these things just can't happen. And therefore, they didn't happen. And you see, that is also a faith statement. When you hear somebody say things like miracles don't happen, without, even though there are testimonies, millions of testimonies to the actuality of miracles in the past, in the present, and there will continue to be such testimonies of dramatic miracles. When you hear somebody make a dogmatic statement like that, that's a faith statement. It's not a statement based on evidence. It is an assumption or a faith statement. It's just a negative faith statement. That's what it is.
So in the last several hundred years, and among this group we've talked about this in the past, but in the last several hundred years, as you well know, among New Testament researchers, among New Testament scholars, we've had what are known as quests, right, for the historical Jesus, quests for the historical Jesus, and you all know about that. We've talked about that. But as we get going this morning and come around to Jesus now, can you say just a little bit about these three quests and their relevance or purported relevance for engaging the New Testament today?
Sure. The three quests really originally arose out of Germany, and in particular people like Albert Schweitzer. Now here's something you may not know. Albert Schweitzer was a theologian long before, and a New Testament scholar long before he was a medical missionary in Africa. What we know about Albert Schweitzer is, he gave his life over to medical missionary work in Africa. Well, before that, he was a German New Testament scholar who was very critical in his study of Jesus and the Gospels, and also Paul and his letters. I mean, Schweitzer's basic thesis about Jesus was Jesus predicted the end of the world in his lifetime, and he was wrong. And therefore, you sort of have to take what Jesus says with a grain of salt because, bless his little heart, he was wrong about the timing of the end of the world. And therefore, you kind of have to critically sort of sift the wheat from the chaff. And Schweitzer really kind of got the ball rolling with the critical quest for who Jesus really was. And the assumption behind the quest was that who he is on the printed page of the Bible is one thing. But who he really was, well, we need to ferret that out from the evidence because you just can't take the Bible on face value about really who Jesus was. And that's what set the first quest for the historical Jesus into motion. And that kind of petered out after World War I and into World War II. Those voices kind of were silenced. You may remember what happened to Germany in World War I and World War II. They were more than a little busy recovering from world wars. But the second quest for the historical Jesus also arises basically out of Germany. It comes out of the teachings of Rudolf Bultmann and Martin Debelius and existentialism. What Bultmann was about more than anything else was appropriating French philosophy, Sartre, Camus, those kind of people, and saying, well, if we're going to make the Jesus of the Gospels or the Paul in his letters relevant today, we need to interpret it through modern philosophy, existentialism in particular, okay? And so, again, what they're trying to do is sift the Gospels and the New Testament for data that can meet their criteria of modern relevance. And see, that's the other part of it. The assumption is the Bible is not inherently relevant. You have to make it relevant. You have to make it relevant. So that's quest number 2. It's over by sort of the late 60s or the early 70s, and nothing is really happening for a while in regard to searching for the historical Jesus. Then you go to part 3, the sequel. And the third quest for the historical Jesus is different. It's different in 2 regards. On the one hand, you do have the Jesus Seminar, which many of you may have heard of, founded by Robert Funk, who a long time ago in his youth went to Johnson City Bible College in Tennessee and has kind of rejected all of his really conservative past. The Jesus Seminar actually was just sort of picking up the agenda of the first 2 quests and pursuing it more vigorously, especially in regard to the sayings of Jesus. So you may remember that the Jesus Seminar would get together and vote on whether the sayings of Jesus were authentic or not, you know. And if a vote got a majority, if a saying got a majority of the votes, well, then Jesus probably said it, okay? And so they sort of decided it by vote, which is interesting. Rather than by historical criteria, they decided to do the American democratic thing, and we'll vote on it, you know, and that'll decide whether it's true or not. Well, we all know that voting on something doesn't make something true or false. It just doesn't. So there actually was another side, and has been another side to the third quest for the historical Jesus, and that's what I would call the evangelical response, the more conservative response that's involved people like Tom Wright that we've been studying, and me, and a bunch of other people who are saying, hold the phone here. Why is it that people who don't have a dog in their fight, like ancient historians and classicists, think there's much more historical substance to the Gospels and the New Testament than you guys who are sort of radical people with your hair on fire saying Jesus said only 15% of what Jesus said? You know, what's wrong with this picture? Well, the third quest has involved a lot of evangelical responses and a lot of books. A lot of books by Tom and me and various other people. I did a critique book of the third quest called The Jesus Quest. And so we were actually finally pushing back against all 3 quests more than anything else and saying there's another way to approach this without having a frontal lobotomy, still fully using your mind, still thinking critically, and maybe y'all are wrong about this.
So you brought up Funk and the Jesus Seminar and the using beads to sort of vote on different colored beads. Obviously, any discussion on the historical Jesus is going to raise questions about the Gospels.
Right.
And especially, and in particular, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. And one question that I think the average churchgoer, the average lay person might struggle to understand is why we have three very similar yet different accounts of these Gospels, often called the synoptic problem. And those who want to sort of cast aspersions on the text always seem to have this topic, I think, in their hip pocket, ready to pull out like a referee throwing a flag, right? And what's one way to come at this issue and to do so not having a sort of crisis of faith?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to be said is almost all scholars, with very few exceptions, think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the earliest Gospels ever written. You all know there are other Gospels out there that were written in the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas, and we could go on, the Gospel of Thomas, right? But, so the real historian says we need to go to the earliest evidence we've got about Jesus, and the earliest evidence is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Stick with those and you can't go wrong, right? They are our earliest historical documents about Jesus. Now, the vast majority of scholars, moderate, conservative, and liberal, will say Mark is probably the earliest gospel. Matthew and Luke used Mark and come a bit later, maybe in the 70s or 80s. And then the Gospel of John is, most scholars think, is an independent testimony that probably was written in the 90s AD, but the author seems to know the basic Markan outliner account, but he's not dependent on it as a source. He's writing an individual report. So that's kind of the history of the gospel tradition. As to why the synoptics are so similar, and yet there are some notable differences in the accounts, right? Here's what I would say. The Gospels are not like modern Nikon snapshots. They're like portraits. So let me draw you an analogy, okay? I love the Impressionist painters, and one of my favorites is Monet. And he painted 4 portraits of the front of Rouen Cathedral. Same cathedral, same subject matter, at slightly different times because of the lighting. I mean, Impressionist art is all about the lighting, And so you have 4 paintings that are recognizably the same subject matter, but with different colors and different hues in them. Now, nobody in their right mind would say, well, this painting is Rouen Cathedral, but this is Notre Dame in Paris, right? Everybody agrees the subject matter is the same, but each of these portraits is interpretive. It's not like a snapshot. It's a portrait. And nobody would criticize the painting by going up right next to the canvas and say, okay, right here, which is where the door is on the front of Rouen Cathedral, this painting has yellow, but this one's got pink and this one's got orange in the same spot. This is a contradiction. Nobody would say that. And why not? Because they would understand that these are portraits, not photographs. I would say this is also what we have in our Gospels. Jesus is such a big, complex, deep, rich subject that on the one hand we have 3 Gospel writers who portray him in a similar manner and in dependency on each other, but with their own flavor, with their own nuances, with their own editing of the material. And especially when you're looking at Matthew and Luke and you see the ways that they are different from Mark, you assume that the changes they have made are intentional changes. They're not accidental, and they are changes meant to serve the larger picture of Jesus that they want to present, the larger nuances they want to bring out that Mark didn't bring out. These are not contradictions. These are value added to the text, and that's how you should look at the minor differences between these accounts. But when you get to the Gospel of John, this is a horse of a different color. For example, in Mark's Gospel, the primary miracle Jesus performs in the first 8 chapters is exorcisms. There are no exorcisms in the Gospel of John. Second example, the primary teaching that Jesus does in all the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is by parables. Guess what? There are 0 parables in the Gospel of John. Instead, we have these long I am discourses. So the portrait of Jesus is remarkably different. In Mark, the portrait is stark and dark. In John, you got light everywhere. And it's obvious from the very first verse, this is G-O-D with a capital G-O-D, who came down from heaven for us, right? So there are intentional differences that Jesus is such a big figure. Thank goodness we have 4 portraits of him, because no one portrait could have captured the fullness of who Jesus was.
I like that answer. You bring up the issue of, you talk about the portraits as interpretation going on.
Right.
What about the argument, the idea that these gospel writers, interpreters, were going about adding all sorts of embellishments, niceties, perhaps even slanting the truth? What do we make of that?
Well, it's certainly true that there are differences, okay? And it does no good to just sort of ignore the differences or try to explain them by explaining them away. The question you have to ask about the differences is, does this subtract from the historical authenticity of the text, or is it adding extra material, value-added material, that helps us better understand the historical Jesus rather than distorting the picture? And I would say it's B rather than A. So I'll give you one good example. In the Gospel of Mark, the portrait of Jesus is stark, and the disciples come across as the disciples. They really just don't get it. Over and over again, they just don't get it. I mean, the classic example is Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration. He takes Peter, James, and John, and afterwards he tells them again, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed on the 3rd day, rise. And he's sort of given them all this teaching about humility. And he's coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and one of the Zebedee boys sidles up to Jesus and says, Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, can I have a box seat on the right and on the left for me and my brother? You know, he absolutely doesn't get what the kingdom is about. He doesn't get what resurrection is about. And he sure doesn't get the humility thing at all, you know. And so the disciples are painted starkly as struggling to understand. In Matthew, the term that's used of the disciples over and over again is not ye of no faith, but ye of little faith, oligopistoi. So the portrait of the disciples is a little less harsh, and it's true of Jesus as well. At one point in the Gospel of Mark, somebody comes to him and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit everlasting life? And Jesus says, why do you call me good? Nobody's good but God alone. It's like he bites his head off. It's like, whoa, dude, chill. You know, I can see the rich young ruler going, I wasn't ready for that. You know, in the same passage, in the parallel in Matthew, here's how Jesus responds to the rich young ruler. He says, why do you ask me about the good? Nobody is good but God alone. Now, that is a difference. He doesn't say, why do you call me good? He says, why do you ask me about the good? This is an obvious difference, right? And it's not a difference as a result of corrupt text or anything like this. Matthew has softened the blow that we get in Mark. And so you have to ask, is this a distortion of the truth? Or is it that Matthew is trying to get us to see a different side of Jesus, the compassionate side, the merciful side of Jesus? And he wants to recognize that the disciples didn't always get it wrong, so he's presenting the disciples that way. Now, that's how I would read this. It's an interpretive portrait, and again, it's a portrait. It's not a snapshot.
Let me piggyback on this then with another question. You're talking about the sort of historical veracity, authenticity is the word you use, historical authenticity of the text. Are there solid criteria that readers and interpreters of the Bible can and should use when attempting to approach texts like the Gospels?
Mm-hmm. Well, a historian has in his toolbox a series of criteria that he would apply to an ancient text to try to sort out what is historical and what is not. Now, understand, it's one thing to say something is historically verifiable. It's another thing to say it's historical, right? Because the methodology is limited. Right. There are limitations to what a historian can demonstrate using his criteria likely happened in ancient history. Just because you can't demonstrate that something happened or prove it, much less prove it, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Right. It just means it doesn't meet these criteria. And that's one of the things I think lay people don't really understand. So what are the criteria? Well, one of the criteria to figure out what Jesus really said amongst the things he is credited with saying is the criteria of standing apart from its context. Okay? In other words, if Jesus says something that's not found earlier in Jewish teachings and stands apart from later Christian teaching as well, the criterion of dissimilarity says, by golly, he must have said this. Because you can't attribute it to them trying to portray Jesus as a typical Jew. Those typical Jews didn't say this. And on the other hand, you can't assume he's being portrayed as a typical Christian because typical Christians didn't say this, right? So, for example, in Mark 7, when Jesus says, it's not what enters your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of your heart, right? And the Markan evangelist, in parenthesis, just so we clearly get the point, he says, thus Jesus declares all foods clean, right? Now, what do we know about early Jews? Did they have food laws? Survey says, yes, they did. And what about the earliest Jewish Christians? Did they have food laws? Oh, yes, they did. So you even have this story in Acts 10 where Peter has to get a subsequent revelation of little piggies in a blanket coming down from the sky. And the vision says, get up, arise, kill, and eat. And Peter's going, I am so not eating barbecue, right? And then the visionary voice says, don't call unclean what God has made clean. Now, you see, the view that Jesus himself said, these food laws just don't apply anymore. We've got a new kingdom situation going here, and they just don't apply anymore. Well, that didn't come from early Judaism, and it sure didn't come from the earliest Jewish Christians in the church. Ergo, Jesus must have said this, right? So that's the criteria of dissimilarity. Let's take another criteria. Let's take the criteria of multiple attestation, okay? That is, independent sources. Now, see, this is where it becomes a little squirrely, because if Mark came first and Matthew and Luke both used Mark as sources, then those are not independent witnesses, right? So who are the independent witnesses? Well, Paul would be an independent witness. The Gospel of John would be an independent witness. And maybe whoever compiled Jesus' greatest hits, his sayings that Matthew and Luke used but didn't get from Mark, that would be an independent witness. So, for example, let's take the story of the Last Supper just for a minute. We hear in 1 Corinthians 11, which is our earliest account of the Last Supper, because the Gospels were all written later than Paul's letter. On the night when Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, broke it, and said, this is my body, this is my blood. Now, this is an independent testimony, because Paul is not reading Mark's Gospel and copying here, This is a tradition that has been orally passed down to him. So when we go back to Matthew, Mark, and Luke and hear the story of the Last Supper, and there is a betrayal, and Shazam, there is this is my body, and there is this is my blood, we go, aha! We have multiply attested that this actually happened. It was actually said. This was an actual event. Well, that's the kind of criteria. I mean, there are many more I could bring out, but that's two samples of the kind of criteria historians would use to verify the veracity of an account. And again, remembering that the criteria is limited, so what you can prove is one thing. What may have been true could have been a much larger thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to bridge the gap a little bit between this session and the previous one, where we talked a lot about the Old Testament last time. But what's the relationship, and you started to touch on this last week, what's the relationship, maybe just in a sort of sweeping, broad, nutshell, perhaps kind of way, between the Old Testament and the New Testament? In particular, I'm asking from the perspective of a Christian.
Yeah. The Old Testament is preparatory for what we have in the New. From a Christian point of view, really the right way to read the Bible is backwards first and then forwards. Because, why? Because the fullest revelation of the character of God and the purposes of God and the salvation plan of God and the Christology of Christ himself is far more clearly unveiled in the New Testament. So for the Christian, you need to get that straight. You need to make the main thing, and put the emphasis on the right syllable. So you start with the New Testament, and then you go back and read the Old Testament. And when you read the Old Testament that way, you realize that the light of God is breaking through partial and piecemeal, and we're getting glimpses of the true God and what God wants from his people over the course of the 39 books of the Old Testament, but it's preliminary. It's on the way to getting there. And one way to look at it is the way the author of Hebrews looks at it, who uses a lot of the Old Testament. He uses it typologically. So he'll say, for example, Melchizedek in the Old Testament is not Jesus in advance, but he's an antitype, if you will, a previous actual historical figure that prefigures in history some of the attributes and characteristics of Jesus. So you read the Old Testament typologically, looking for types of who Jesus was. The antitype of a Christian with faith is, of course, Abraham, which is exactly what Paul says in Romans 4 and Galatians 3. So you read the Bible progressively. You realize the fuller revelation is the New Testament. You read it typologically. That's kind of how you should approach that issue.
I'm going to do some rapid fire questions at the end, like one word answers. We're not there yet, but before I want to do right now something similar to that. But let's do a series of top fives. What are the top five in your estimation historical events related to the New Testament?
Okay. Well, they're all Christological. Jesus came, the incarnation. Jesus died on the cross, without which we don't have salvation. Jesus rose again, without which we also don't have salvation, right? Jesus returned to heaven by ascension and sent the Holy Spirit, without which we don't have salvation. And he's back. He's coming back again. So all of my top five would be Christological, because without any of those, we don't have what we have in the New Testament, and really we don't have the Christian faith.
I like that. You guys like that? That's good. What are the top five archaeological sites related to the New Testament?
Oh my goodness. Now this is more difficult, but let's relate it to what I've just said. The first would be Bethlehem. I mean, this is where Jesus was born. He probably wasn't born in the basement of the Church of the Nativity in a hole in the ground, but he was born somewhere in that vicinity, and the archaeological work there is important, okay? But secondly, Golgotha. Well, where is that? again, the crucifixion didn't take place in the basement of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it is probably, and I think we can be more sure about this is probably the location where Jesus died. Because that was a site, it was on a hill, it was outside the old city walls. There is evidence of crucifixion in that spot archaeologically. So there you have it. And then, of course, the third is the resurrection. Well, do we have evidence of resurrection? Well, we have all kinds of things going on there, that are relevant. I will point to just one, which is the James ossuary, which I've had a good deal to do with. You may remember this is a first century Jewish burial box of the brother of Jesus. And the inscription on the box says this: James, son of Joseph, his brother is Jesus. Okay? Now, as I've said before, if your brother gets the chair, of the electric chair, you don't sort of praise your being related to him on your tombstone, right? So the fact that there's this honorific ending to this inscription, James is bragging about being related to Jesus and being also the son of Joseph, right? That tells you that the reputation of Jesus made a dramatic turnaround after the crucifixion, because otherwise in an honor and shame culture, you don't brag about being related to somebody who got capital punishment. You just don't, right? And so the evidence, I think that James ossuary is indirect evidence to the resurrection. Otherwise, the earliest Christians would not be bragging about being related to Jesus. So I would say that's certainly a big one. Now, there are others we could talk about, but those are biggies for sure.
Well, your favorite 5 New Testament interpreters?
Oh, my goodness. Now, that really is a hard one, because I've learned so much from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people.
The top 5 who've influenced you.
Oh, well, okay. All right, I think we can probably do that. It's been my teachers at Gordon Conwell, who were Gordon Fee, very definitely influenced me, and a wonderful Orthodox Assemblies of God hair on fire teacher. He was great. He easily got you fired up about the gospel, and he's written wonderful commentaries on various books of the New Testament. When I did my doctoral work, C.K. Barrett, a good Methodist and a Methodist preacher who was the top New Testament scholar in the English-speaking world in the 70s and 80s, and that's why Ann and I went to England, so I could study with him. So certainly he's been a huge influence on me. In terms of what we were talking about earlier in regard to Jesus, I would say the German scholar Joachim Jeremias has been a big influence on me. And wanting to get back to Jesus' sayings in the original Aramaic and figuring out what they meant in their original context, he would certainly, be a big one, a major one that I've read over and over again, and had a major impact on me. And then there are a whole series of Pauline scholars I could name: C.F.D. Moe, Jimmy Dunn, Tom Wright, whom you know. I mean, there have been a lot of them that have influenced me.
I'm going to change gears a little bit now. We're thinking about history. Next question, big question, related to Israel. This is actually a couple of questions rolled into one. What's Israel's role, first in biblical history, and then a close second on that? Does Israel have any specific role in world history in general? In short, talk about the Israel of the Bible and its relation to the broad sweep of history, if there is any relationship.
In 5 words or less, right? Yeah. Okay. Israel is God's chosen people in the Bible, no question, end of story. We can summarize that very quickly, that God chose the Jewish people to shed light on the world about the real nature of there being only one God, and God's plan to be reconciled to humanity through the revelation of that truth. Okay? So that's Israel in the Bible. But what happens when Jesus comes along? Well, the story sort of shifts and morphs. And what happens is that God's people becomes more inclusive. It's Jew and Gentile united in Christ. And that's how the New Testament views the people of God. It's Jew and Gentile united in Christ. And that's the people of God going forward. Now, that doesn't mean that the Old Testament people of God have no more role to play in human history. What Paul says, who's the deepest thinker on this subject, he says in Romans 9 through 11, that Jews who reject Jesus have been temporarily, underline the word temporarily, broken off from the people of God until the full number of Gentiles are saved. This is what he says in Romans 10 and Romans 11. And then he says, after the full number of Gentiles have come in, then in like manner, that is by grace through faith in Jesus himself, all Israel will be saved. And so Paul envisions that at the end of human history, when Jesus comes back, when the Redeemer comes back from heavenly Zion, there will be a large number of Jews reincorporated into the people of God. The big point is, there is only one people of God at any one point in human history. There are not now, for example, two peoples of God, the church over here and Israel over here. This view no New Testament writer accepts. There's just one people of God, but God is not finished with non-Christian Israel yet. So Christians do well to respect them and befriend them, and when there's an opportunity, even share the gospel with them. Because God's not finished with them yet. He hasn't rejected his first chosen people. But what that does not mean is that all along, between the coming of Jesus and now, Israel plays some kind of significant role in fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. No. What Paul says, I think, stands. All of the promises of God and all of the prophecies of God are fulfilled in Jesus Christ and not elsewhere. Not elsewhere. So what happened in 1948 when Israel, after the Holocaust, was given back a right to be in the Holy Land? Is this somehow a fulfillment of prophecy? Probably not. There's nothing in the Bible about that happening in the 20th century, despite lots of preachers on television telling you otherwise. I don't see this as either a sign of the end times or a sign that Israel's continuing to play, non-Christian Israel's continuing to play a major role in human history. Really, there's nothing in the Bible that really suggests that. Once the Messiah comes, it's the Messiah's people who are playing that role of evangelizing the world and sharing the good news and that sort of stuff.
So, yeah, I want to hit on something you said there. A lot of folks, I mean, this politically charged issue, especially at the moment, but a lot of folks have some really, really interesting views about the relationship between Israel and history, Israel and the church, Israel and Christians today, Israel and the United States today.
Right.
And some really go crazy with all these sorts of predictions. You brought up prophecy, brings up the issue of prophecy. Talk for a moment about what is prophecy, and is there a relationship, you did kind of touch on it, between history and prophecy, but then I want to follow this up with another question right after.
Well, prophecy in the Bible is mostly, if it's dealing with the future at all, sometimes prophecy is simply revealing the truth about the present. If you read the Old Testament prophets over and over again, they are truth tellers. They are soothsayers. That's who they are, telling the truth about the present. So, I mean, when Nathan goes and confronts David about this little Bathsheba episode and says, "You demand," you know, he's telling the truth to power about a current situation. That's what he's doing, right? That is prophecy, the revealing of the truth in the present, and in this case, about the present. But prophets also do speak about the near future as well. And some of those prophecies are very particular and very accurate. Jesus himself is a prophet like this. He says that within a generation, the temple itself in Jerusalem, the Herodian temple, is going down for the count. And sure enough, Jesus dies in 30. When does the temple go down? In AD 70. How long is a biblical generation? 40 years. Jesus is an accurate prophet. He's right about that. So there is a prophecy about the near horizon and things that are happening soon. When prophets in the Old Testament talk about the more distant horizon, they are not real specific. They talk in generalities or metaphors. The lion's going to lie down with the lamb. Without thinking of lamb chops. We're going to beat the swords into the plowshares. This is metaphors, right? The prophecies about the more distant future are giving us the character of the future without predicting the timing of the future. That's a very different matter. It's revealing the character of the future and who's in charge, namely God. It's not up to us. We're not making these things happen. And I like to put it this way. God reveals enough of the future in prophecy to give us hope, but not so much that we don't have to live by faith every single day. Mm-hmm. So what I think is going on when you have all these prognostications and calculations is simply the human attempt to get control over a very uncertain future. What it really is psychologically is some Christians get antsy, and they can't really live with uncertainty very well. It makes them insecure, right? So they sort of want to go for the theological jackpot and say, okay, we know that here are 5 things that are going to happen in the next 20 years, ISIS being one of the most recent ones, right? And therefore, these are all clear harbingers that Jesus is coming back, so we need to batten down the hatches, and we need to start canning food, and all that sort of stuff, because the tribulation is coming, and Jesus is coming back. Well, what I would say is that's fear-based thinking, not faith-based thinking. And what fear does, when it grips us, is it makes us want to try harder, to grip harder on controlling the things about the future that we can control. And that's where all this prognostication and calculation comes from.
Mm-hmm. So, related to this, I don't think we can talk about these sorts of things and not bring Revelation, into this discussion. Does Revelation, not Revelations, by the way, Revelation, the Book of John, talk about Book of John's Revelation, talk about the end of history? Does it talk about an Armageddon and what the heck's going on?
Yeah, it certainly does talk about the more remote future. It also talks about near judgments, those whole 3 sets of 7 judgments, the seals, the bowls, the trumpets, all that sort of stuff, are preliminary judgments. They're not final judgment, Final judgment comes after that when Jesus comes back, when the rider on the white horse shows up. The Lone Ranger finally comes over the horizon, the rider on the white horse, and the final events of human history transpire. And yes, there is an Armageddon. Interestingly, it's after Jesus has come and reigned on the earth for a while, and there's not really a battle. I mean, if you look at Revelation 20 and what it says about Har-Megiddo, about the final cataclysm, basically it's just an execution. The armies of the earth gather around God's chosen people, and Jesus simply says, "You're toast." Fire comes down from heaven. We're done. No battle. Not going to be a battle at Megiddo. It's going to be an execution, according to Revelation 20. So, battles that we have now in Iraq, in Iran, and wherever else we have battles, really nothing to do with that, because none of that's going to happen until Jesus comes back. And, you better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Jesus Christ is coming to town. He knows when you've been sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. I'm not kidding. The book of Revelation says, when Jesus comes back, then you will know the end is at hand. And short of that, you don't know. You need to be always ready for when the thief of the night is going to come. You need to always be prepared for when that's actually going to happen. I like what C.S. Lewis says about this. He says, when the author of the play steps out on the stage, the play is over. Right? When Jesus comes back, then you will know the play is over. The human drama has been brought to its climax, and we're done. But that doesn't mean that's the end of space and time, because what the end of the Bible says, and what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, is that when Jesus comes back, he's going to raise the dead. There's going to be a new heaven and a new earth. We're going to have a great big family reunion of all God's people. All Israel will be joining in, and so y'all should start practicing your Hebrew a little bit, because there are going to be a lot of those folks there too, you know. And we will have a glorious conclusion to human history, but brought about by Jesus, not by the machinations of men or the political planning of nations.
All right, we're going to shift gears dramatically here. Rapid fire round. I thought this would be fun. So I was thinking about this yesterday, but some of these are going to be related directly to what we've been talking about this morning. Some a little less so, but short answers, one word, one sentence, just rapid fire as we end here. One, favorite New Testament story?
The Jesus story.
Jesus story. Favorite Old Testament story?
Oh, goodness. That's too hard. You know, it just
He's
is.
answered all these questions. That's too hard.
Maybe the story of Abraham and God's relationship with Abraham.
Favorite Bible character?
Jesus.
Jesus. Other than Jesus?
Okay. Other than Jesus. Peter, I suppose.
Favorite theologian?
I really do enjoy reading a lot of different theologians. But I'll tell you right now, reading John Wesley's theological reflections as insights into the Scripture has done more for my soul than anything else.
Favorite hymn?
Oh, goodness. Okay, favorite Wesley hymn would be "And Can It Be That I Should Gain an Interest in Our Savior's Blood." Favorite other hymn from that whole era would be Isaac Watts' "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross," also from that English revival period. Favorite hymn that came from just after that, "Amazing Grace," John Newton, right? You can tell I like the old ones, right? You know, I love those. Favorite modern hymn is "For All the Saints" by Ralph Vaughan Williams. I deeply love that.
Favorite ancient, extra, or non-biblical work?
Okay. Oh, I guess Homer's Odyssey.
Favorite biblical site to visit?
Really, you'll be surprised. It's Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus first revealed to his disciples that he is the Christ. I just love that site. It's a spectacular site.
Favorite New Testament commentary?
Oh, you mean author, or you mean which book do I like the best?
Which, just do the desert island, or the island thing. If you were on an island, you had one commentary you could take.
Well, it'd probably be about Romans, and there are a lot of wonderful Romans commentaries. But honestly, I guess the Romans commentary I would take with me to the desert island would probably be what Karl Barth says about Romans. It's powerful.
Funniest biblical law?
Okay, that thing about blending polyester and cotton, and we're not supposed to do that, ladies. Are you listening? No blending cotton and polyester. That one strikes me as a little peculiar.
Most troubling verse or story of the Bible?
Oh, I guess I would have to say that the whole story of Judas is deeply troubling. How does someone spend 3 years of their life with Jesus in person and then do that? You know, I mean, that's so hard to really comprehend.
Least favorite character of the Bible?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I don't know.
Favorite book you've written?
Oh, dear. I don't know that I have a favorite book that I've written.
What was the most enjoyable? What was the most life-giving?
Well, the book that's had the most impact is my books on women in the New Testament, which came out of my dissertation and are still going strong, you know. But the one I think, for me, was a groundbreaking book is The Christology of Jesus. How did Jesus view himself? And that one's continued to do well as well.
Favorite previous doctoral student who graduated from Asbury Seminary last May?
His initials are MH.
A great, memorable moment in your career as a Bible scholar?
There have been a lot of... I've been very blessed. I've taught all over the world, and I've lectured and preached. To me, one of the most memorable moments, I could say many, is the day I was honored with the opportunity to preach in the Moscow Baptist Church, which was the only Protestant church that Stalin wasn't able to shut down. And the reason he wasn't able to shut down is his own grandmother and other babushkas stood at the front door of the church and said, "You are so not closing this church over our dead bodies," right? And he backed off. It's the only one he didn't close, you know. When I got to preach in that church, this is a very conservative environment, so the women are upstairs in a wraparound gallery, if you can picture this, and the men are downstairs. And I got up in the pulpit and I looked up, and here are all these grandmothers standing. You know, and this is where Billy Graham preached when he did his first mission to Moscow. And I was just overwhelmed. Here's the saints in the heavenlies standing up for Jesus, you know. And for me, that was a really humbling moment to see that.
Shawarma or gyro?
Oh, shawarma.
Current book you're working on?
I've just written a little book on how to read the Bible called Reading and Understanding the Bible for lay people and college freshmen. So no $25 words, readable for everybody.
Jesus was married, yes or no?
No.
Paul was married, yes or no?
Yes.
Wow, interesting. If you could go back in time to see one event in the Bible, it would be...
Oh, I would like to be there on Easter morning. I would like to be there on Easter morning.
Favorite John Wesley quote?
John Wesley said, "I am homo unius libri. I am a man of one book. God has seen fit to give us that book. At any price, at all price, give me that book, and I shall be satisfied."
Hebrews, written by Paul, yes or no?
No.
No. Last question, very related to history. Where in the world is Carmen Sandiego?
Oh, probably in the same place that, who was that character? Waldo. Was probably on vacation with Waldo.
There we go. Let's thank Ben for talking with us. Thank you all for being here. We'll continue with this next week. Man, thanks. Thank you. That was fun.
It is fun. You ask good questions.